I love the word cosmogony. Cosmogonies are the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the world. And that means the world in the larger sense. I think that cosmogonies help us to exist in the world as societies, as individuals, as cultures. I've got a project called Cosmogonic Tattoos. It's a celebration of two of our museum collections here on the University of Michigan campus. The University of Michigan Museum of Art and the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology. It's a vinyl window mural based entirely on objects in their collections. So what I'm doing on the surface of the buildings is telling a kind of story of how things got to be the way that they are. I knew from the outset that I wanted to make an installation on the windows of these museums using vinyl. I knew that I wanted, whatever I put on that museum, I wanted it to be based on objects inside the museum. I ended up taking individual photographs of objects in the collection. I needed to take the photographs myself because I wanted to transmit something of the experience of being in the collection. Then I laid Mylar over those photographs, and I did quick graphite drawings of the objects that I saw, of the images that I saw, the photographic images underneath. Then I painted it with a shellac-based ink. Then I photographed the Mylar paintings, and I needed to get them translated into Adobe Illustrator. Then I took those digital translations and disassembled them. I made a big catalog of them. I called it my bone pile. And then I would take bits and pieces and recombine them to make the images and ultimately the story and the design for the vinyl. And Dave Mahalik, who has worked with me for over a decade, he cuts my images, and then he has to weed out the negative spaces by hand. He takes out all the parts of the image that are not going to go on the window.
The artist Jim Cogswell has looked at works in both collections very carefully and has taken elements from both of them and recombined them in this wonderful fantasy and this wonderful creation. By doing that, the work seems to suggest that the division between the two collections is not quite as clear-cut, because on the one hand there are pieces in Uma's collection that definitely have archaeological value, while pieces in the Museum of Archaeology's collection certainly have artistic value as well.
There's a divide between these two museums. It's a geographic divide across State Street. It's an institutional divide in the sense that one is an art museum, one's an archaeological museum, so there's a kind of disciplinary divide. I decided that the gap between them was really part of the narrative to link them. And that gap became a space across which objects from the Kelsey traveled to Uma, objects from Uma traveled to the Kelsey. So a major theme became that of objects traveling from one place to another. And that led also to thoughts about the mutability of objects and meanings. Objects change, and the museums do their best to keep them from changing, but objects change. And so do the meanings we associate with those objects. Context changes it, also the viewer changes it.
I think one of the great things about Jim's work is that it does force the visitor to think about the object in ways that we don't necessarily think about it in the museum. Every visitor brings their own interpretation, their own ideas, their own experiences to looking at objects. By putting these new kind of juxtapositions, putting these objects next to each other in new ways, Jim is forcing the viewer to think about, what is this thing? You know, what is it? How did it get here? What was it used for? Who made it?
I want viewers to be aware of these museums. I want them to begin to think critically, self-consciously about what museums do. I want them to become aware of how they are recreating these objects. I want them to become aware of how they open up the objects themselves. And ultimately, I think I want them to understand that objects and meanings change. They change depending on who you are and where you are and the context that you inhabit. If there's anything that never changes, it's that everything always changes.